My name is Greg Remke. I work with economic thinking. We hold workshops and provide resources on the economics of high school and homeschool debate topics. Recently, the NCFCA League announced their choices for the next debate season for policy and LD, and among the three options in each, one policy choice is on the European Union should significantly reform its immigration policy, and also a Lincoln Douglas option, immigration is a human right. So these are valuable topics, and what I thought I'd do is give a brief overview of some of the economics of this as I would present it at workshops on this topic, and as I have presented it in the past. We had a debate topic on immigration reform just a couple years ago in the public school league. So the European Union should substantially reform its immigration policy. It's a valuable topic in a number of ways. It's a really important area, but in the United States, it's an election year. It's a politically charged topic, and it's a difficult one for students to debate in a forum where lay judges may be ideologically, dramatically opposed or very much in favor. And so a way to sidestep that and still address immigration issues is to look at immigration for the European Union. It's an important issue. It's a major problem in Europe, or a challenge. And students researching this are going to learn about Europe, learn about countries, geography, learn the history, why some European countries are doing very well, why some aren't. The challenge of terrorism and other issues and infectious diseases is going to be as relevant in Europe as it is in the US. So it's a way to develop research and learn about this topic without getting drawn into a highly charged debate in the debates in the US. Immigration is a human right. Of course, this draws into history in the sense that, America's founders and most Americans were escaping from poverty and bad government and problems in Europe, came to the United States. Rich people tended not to leave, but poor people looking for opportunity, and they got that opportunity and prosperity in the U.S. The same would be the case in Hong Kong in the 1950s. Millions immigrated, impoverished from communist China, escaping communism, and they came to Hong Kong, worked incredibly long hours, and within, a generation, Hong Kong becomes a prosperous country. So there is development economists make the point that there's no faster way to prosperity than migration. You move from a poor country to a wealthy country, your income levels can double and triple. Why is that? Because the institutions in prosperous countries work better and there's more capital. So do people have a right to, protect their children and their family and live a better life? That would be the argument for a freedom of movement. However, you could also say, well, do people in a country have a right to protect themselves from immigrants that might come, from caravans coming from Honduras that come up through Mexico and hit the border with thousands applying for asylum or wanting to get into the U.S.? Is there any set of rights that people in a country have to choose who comes into that country, which would be naturalization laws? So freedom of movement, labor mobility, these are all issues tied up in this topic. Economists generally argue that the benefits of immigration are overwhelming. This has to do with enterprise, the kind of people that are attracted through immigration, people with a lot of get up and go, right? They get up and they go. They go to places where they think they have a better opportunity. That's not to disparage people who stay home, but simply immigrants tend to be dynamic people who are willing to, leave their family and what they know behind to try something in another place, a better world. So that makes countries with more immigration more dynamic and prosperous. We have lots of evidence on this. Politics are a challenge. Immigrants come in, they want to vote, but maybe their background is from the country they came from. So do you give immigrants the right to vote, or what's the process to become a citizen? Also, welfare benefits that go to anybody who's poor. Well, all the immigrants are poor, or most are poor. Should they qualify for benefits paid for by U.S. citizen taxpayers? How much is, that a burden? Those are political discussions and debates. Culture is an issue. People might not like immigrant culture, the way they treat women, let's say in Islamic countries or in other countries. They bring those cultural traditions to America. But also there's a lot of cultural dynamism, food, music, a lot of the benefits we get from culture from other places. Overwhelming the sort of the economics, politics, and cultural issues is a concern about terrorism and concern about crime. After 9/11, the concerns that Islamic fundamentalists and other sort of ideological crazy people might come in as immigrants and carry out terror. Or we might have more criminals. You know, if you're a criminal in Mexico City, maybe you want to steal from people in the U.S. because they're wealthier. Candidate Donald Trump, running for office, in many of his public appearances, brought with him Americans who'd had husbands and wives, sons and daughters murdered by criminals who were illegal immigrants. And so he said, we need to protect the country. We need to build a wall. That brought a lot of people to the Trump presidential campaign. Critics of that say, look, you know, immigrants are less likely to be criminals than people domestically. But also, if your concern is with terrorism or crime, why not focus your border patrol and police efforts on terrorists and criminals, potential criminals, current criminals, instead of trying to, you know, catch the hundreds of thousands, millions of people that just want to work, pick lettuce, help around the house or roofing. So we have this huge apparatus, spends a lot of money to capture undocumented aliens. Much of that could be directed toward people that are potential criminals and terrorists. So again, back and forth on that. Now an issue with the coronavirus pandemic. Concern is that terrorists could come, or immigrants could come in and have an infectious disease, even if it's not showing itself. So President Trump's recently called for stopping immigration entirely because, gosh, immigrants could be infected. And we've long been concerned with tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, Ebola, that immigrants might come in because there's lots of diseases around the world. But this applies not only to immigrants, but to tourists and anybody who would come into the country. Still, for the European Union, economic issues, political, cultural, terrorism, crime, infectious diseases, those are all on the table for this topic. Relevant for the topic is the history of migration in Europe. Europe is a dynamic place in large part because of immigration. And we can look at the history of that over the last couple decades and last few centuries. We also have a broader issue of economic freedom. People are often migrating from places that are less economically free to countries and regions that are more economically free. But also in Europe, many of the problems that are blamed on migration are actually problems of the welfare state and labor regulations that make it hard to start small companies in Europe, but easier to get welfare benefits that are problematic and sort of debilitating in many ways and make people more of a target for terrorist ideas, at least in the evidence we have so far. So many issues to debate on this topic. You could say current EU immigration regulations arbitrary, counterproductive. These labor regulations and welfare often promote enclaves, so the riots outside Paris, the places where it's dangerous for women to go, they get harassed. Those are places full of different cultures where, you know, women don't go out alone in public, have their heads covered. This is an issue with enclaves in Sweden and other areas as well, which people, instead of adapting and integrating into the culture, the country they come to, they're allowed to stay in pockets where there's problems, to say the least. Now, we don't want to force people to integrate. Italian neighborhoods and Chinatowns in the U.S. have been ethnically and culturally different for decades, for a century. But we don't want to create places that create political turmoil and make people sad, that don't promote human flourishing. The moral and ethical claims, again, to what degree should people be able to move from places that are dangerous for themselves and their families to places that are safer and where they can prosper. Particularly with all the millions of refugees stuck in camps in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, those people, shouldn't they have a right to go someplace and not be locked up in a camp where they're told they can't work and they just have to survive with their kids. Some have been there for years, decades. We have evidence of successful refugee locations in Uganda and elsewhere. We have organizations, refugee cities, projects trying to allow refugees to come. Hong Kong, of course, was a refugee location for Communist Chinese for a long time. History of European immigration in the last couple decades, the last couple centuries. And again, the economic claims, the costs, and the benefits. So here's just an example of, consider the most successful, dynamic, big country in Europe. It's Germany. Germany's incredibly dynamic, and that follows. I mean, why is that? Well, it's because it's full of Germans. You know, they work hard, they're industrious. Well, yeah, Germany is. I mean, I'm part German. I'd like to believe that Germans are, you know, great. But for many decades, East Germans were poor, West Germans were prosperous. So it's not just being German, it's the institutions that the country has. And it turns out it's immigration. So Germany, for example, after World War II, Germany's devastated. But in the decades after was the German economic miracle, where the country just took off. Part of that was economic reforms that reduced regulations and allowed markets to function. But another big part was the huge migration of Germans that had been expelled from the countries they lived in, all through Europe, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. After 2 world wars, countries said, we don't want these Germans anymore. So it was a devastating, disastrous experience. Many died, but many made it to Germany, and they were a key part of the German economic miracle, the additional people that came to Germany. Later, during the Cold War, huge numbers of people came from Yugoslavia to Germany to work. And this, at the time, people claimed that this was Tito, the president of Yugoslavia, had this special version of communism that worked well because Yugoslavia was prospering more than other Eastern European countries. But it turned out a big part of it, he just let people out. So people emigrated from Yugoslavia to the U.S., to Australia. Large numbers went to Germany to work in the factories. They made a bunch of money. They send money home. They would come back regularly bringing products from Germany. So the prosperity in Yugoslavia came from allowing people to leave and go work, a labor mobility. The Yugoslav workers also helped the German economic miracle continue as they needed more workers for growing factories. So the Germans benefited, the Yugoslavs benefited, and Yugoslavia, the country, benefited as it had more prosperous people. Next came huge migration from Turkey. Vast numbers of people moved from Turkey to Germany to work. Germany had a more open immigration policy. Again, this benefited the German economy. There were lots of complaints about the Turkish immigrants. I mean, they're Islamic, they're this, they're that. It took time for, it wasn't until some of the Turkish immigrants of the next generation became soccer football stars that, you know, attitudes toward Turkish immigrants improved. But that played a major role. So part of the dynamic German economy were German immigrants, Yugoslav laborers, Turkish immigrants and laborers, and then in recent years, large Syrian migration into Germany, and there again filling positions in the German economy. Partly the fertility rate is low in all of Western Europe, so there's not enough children being born to fill these jobs. So this is part of the benefit of immigrants. Also, England, one of the more dynamic countries in Europe, and they've had large immigration from Poland, from Romania, from India. And these workers, many are moved to London and other cities to work. Many migrate back and forth since airfare is so inexpensive. But it's a significant part of and similarly in France, there's complaints about immigrants, but a lot of immigration has been very healthy for the European economy. Sweden as well, and migrants from Eastern Europe coming to Western Europe, and so forth. So here's a global look at. I mentioned the dynamism of immigrants. One example from the U.S. is the Greek yogurt that is very popular now. Well, that came from a guy from Turkey who came as a graduate student in the U.S. in business school. His father came, and his father couldn't stop complaining about how crummy the yogurt was in America. And He tells his son, you should go in the yogurt business. And his son says, I didn't come all the way to America to make yogurt. Well, it turned out he did. And that was the founder of Chobani yogurt, the Greek yogurt, hugely popular, a yogurt that millions of Americans think is better than the yogurt they had. It's an immigrant company. Lots of immigrants work for it, as well as lots of Americans work for Chobani. But also, U.S. yogurt companies copied the idea. They can make Greek yogurt too, just a thicker strained yogurt. So the dynamism of just a better food that comes from an immigrant who looked around and wanted to make improvements. Similarly, Amar Pete comes from Holland to San Francisco. He thinks the coffee is terrible, Folgers grade B coffee. He starts Pete's Coffee, making higher quality European coffee. And there's enough immigrants, enough international people in San Francisco to make it work. He gradually expands as more people learn about it. The president of Starbucks used to work for Pete's. He goes on a vacation in Italy and he sees people sitting in a coffee shop sipping lattes, relaxing. He thinks, why don't we have that in the U.S.? Pete didn't want to do that. He thought people should have coffee at home. Starbucks founder buys the Pete's franchises in Seattle, turns them into Starbucks, and we have this booming coffee industry that is basically European coffee, international coffee brought to the U.S. and then exported. So now Starbucks are all over the world, but again, it was migration that was a big part of that, bringing different ideas to the U.S. In the technology business, you have immigrants who play key roles at Google, PayPal, eBay. 50% of the tech founders at Silicon Valley firms were immigrants. So again, we benefit. Those people create jobs. They create competition against, American engineers, workers, founders, but also they create jobs, raise wages. America is a leader in the tech industry in large part because we've allowed immigrants to come here. We haven't made it easy, but they've come as graduate students. 50% of the engineers and so forth are graduate students, are from other countries. I mentioned Hong Kong. Immigrants built Hong Kong, a big part of it. Now we have Syrian and North African immigrants, refugees coming into Europe. There's a lot of struggle as they try and adapt. They come impoverished. They lack the language skills. But also we have Eastern European migrants to Western Europe. So the Polish plumbers people used to complain about in the 90s or 2000s, their English wasn't very good, but they were good plumbers and they offered services. They've moved up in industry. So immigrants played a major role. Even in the 1980s, we had a large illegal immigration from Ireland into the U.S. Something like 2/3 of Irish college students left Ireland within 6 months of graduating in the 1980s. Large numbers came to New York and Boston. They worked illegally in restaurants and firms. Gradually, they became U.S. citizens, and they added a lot to the dynamism of the U.S. economy. Also, we have a strange story that's told in Philip Legrain's book on immigrants of Israel's immigrant experience. Imagine if you had a country that in 1 year got 15% of its entire population in new immigrants, people who lacked job skills or language skills. So U.S. with 300 million, what if we got, 45 million people came in 1 year to the U.S.? You'd imagine chaos and screaming and people's heads would explode. But that was actually Israel's experience. After the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union particularly, you had all these Jewish people who had been trying to get out of the Soviet Union but couldn't. Once Soviet Union was gone, they had a window of opportunity, but there was only one country that would accept them, and that was Israel. Israel's right of return, written in its constitution, they cannot deny any Jewish person the right to come to Israel. So they did. 15% of the entire Israeli population came in 1 year from formerly communist countries, from Soviet Union, mostly Ukraine. And so what happened? Well, it turned out there was an uptick in unemployment for a year. There was some turmoil, but within a couple years, the Israeli economy was booming. These immigrants added dramatically to the dynamism of the Israeli economy. I mean, there were downsides. Palestinians, let's say, were less attractive compared, or their wage rates went down compared to immigrants. But by and large, it was a snapshot of how prosperous countries can absorb large numbers of low-skilled immigrants and boost the economy. Again, not proof, but just evidence. So we have lots of stories of global migration and innovation. This is the story of Philip Lagrange telling this, and should be available online, or I've got this. It was an interview that was online. I can send it if you're interested. So a more open immigration, if the European Union were to become more open to immigration. We have examples. British's experience, they opened with the expanded EU in 2004, they opened to immigration from Romania, which was a much poorer country, Poland and other places. There were some 75 million people who could have migrated from their poor countries to the wealthiest country of England, wealthier country in England. But in fact, a small fraction came. There's a documentary on my something like my big fat Romanian immigration. On the day that they completely opened up for Romanian immigrants into the UK, the concern was they would come flooding in. The newspapers were out, the journalists were out there at the airport. All these cameras were there on the first flight in from Romania, and there was like only one guy who shows up. So they have a documentary about that one guy. But it's interesting that most people don't want to leave home. Even if they're poor, they have family connections, cultural connections. Some people do leave. But what we have, according to Lagrange, a lot is, again, labor mobility. People that fly inexpensively from Romania or Poland, they work during the week or a few weeks in England and then fly back. So changing immigration laws, and again, language-wise, what's immigration, what's labor mobility, improving the ability of people to move, to migrate, to work. A lot of the people from Poland don't want to be English citizens. They don't want to vote in the elections. They just want to work and earn money, maybe go home or live in their own little community. So how can we sidestep the political battles and just allow the economic benefits? So books on this: Borderless Economics by Robert Guest. Arrival City looks at the biggest story in the entire world is migration to cities, whether it's to Istanbul and Turkey, to the cities in India and Africa, building the shanty towns. Some 200 million people in China are part of the floating population who've migrated to cities to work, although they're not legally allowed to do that. So around the world, migration is a big, big deal. This topic for the European Union is simply how do we reform their policies to make them more sensible, more safe, and more secure. I'll finish with this one book, one of my favorites, Closed Borders by Alan Dowdy. This is from 1987, from a long time ago, but it's important to get some historical perspectives. All through European history, there have never been restrictions on movement until World War I. So all through the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s, people could, a Frenchman could live his whole life in England. People could move from place to place. It was only in World War I that passports were established as a temporary wartime measure. Now, there were restrictions in Russia and Turkey at some times, and there were border controls in the Austro-Hungarian Empire to stop people with the plague coming in for a century and a half from the Balkans. So there is some history of restrictions, of course, but by and large, from the 1800s to the early 1900s, there was an open system. So Dowdy argues, and this is a historian making this claim, human history is the history of movement. The most dynamic places in the world have the most migration because people come with ideas, with technologies. Migration, they say, is a principal drive wheel of historic change. Migration, the means for diffusion of ideas, techniques, cultures, and new advances are stimulated. This is not to say that immigrants do everything. It's just to say that immigrants are a stimulant. That is, they come with new ideas, people here respond to them, and so it's a back and forth. You look at some of the people with the strongest issue in surveillance technology in Silicon Valley, they're people that grew up in the Soviet Union, and they knew the importance of having some sort of protection from government, and they bring those passions to their work in the U.S. So That's a positive view of migration and the importance of it. On the negative side, sure, you have problems with terrorism, disease, crime, and those are things that's part of the role of security organizations to try and limit that motion. And there are ways to do that. The Kriebel plan, the red card solution, just says if someone wants to come here to work, they go to an employment agency in the country they're in, they apply for a job, they get checked to see whether they're a terrorist or a criminal, they get checked to see if they have disease, then they come and work. They get a 5-year work visa, renewable work visa, they work, they pay their taxes. If they, don't commit crimes and so forth, then they get to stay. Anyway. Lots to discuss on this topic. I hope these have been helpful, and I'll have a link to these overheads in the comments.